Right. Well, thank you very much. On behalf of the committee, can I express our thanks to our second panel today for coming to give evidence. Could I say, in particular, I would like to thank the British in Europe group for the very comprehensive piece of work that you have put together on the rights of UK citizens in different EU countries and their plans. This is and will be extremely helpful to the committee in considering the matters we are talking about today. Can I welcome Fiona Godfrey, co-chair of British in Europe Luxembourg, Jane Golding, well actually no, Calba Meadows is next, the steering committee, British in Europe from France, Jane Golding, co-chair of British in Europe from Germany, Jeremy Morgan, vice-chair British in Europe, Italy, and John Richards, steering committee, Euro citizens from Spain. You are all very welcome indeed. Can I begin by asking you this question? Listening, because I think all of you were in the room for the previous evidence session, listening to the circumstances of EU citizens here in the UK, how does that compare with the current position of British citizens in the 27 other member states? Better, worse, kind of the same? And
I think it's a bit more complex than that.
More complex, okay.
Obviously, we are living in 27 different member states.
Sure.
So how I would sum it up is that as a European version of the postcode lottery, we will be treated differently in each country.
Right.
In the case of a no deal. In the case of a deal, obviously, there is a framework at UK-EU level. Some countries will take one system, the declaratory system, and others will go for the constitutive system.
Now,
can I just add something to that? In terms of what you have is had a fairly detailed discussion about a scheme which has started and the rules for which have been laid down. There isn't, I think, I'm probably wrong to say there isn't a single European country in which that has happened. We are mainly looking at potential systems which might kick in when a Brexit happens with no deal. That's the main focus has been on that. So we literally don't know the detail in the same way as EU citizens do here, for the most part.
Now that's a very important point. So would it be fair to say that the position of British citizens in the other 27 countries is behind, or way behind, the position of EU citizens here in the UK?
Behind in terms of time, in other words.
In time, but clarity about
yes.
what they need to do and what rights they will get if they do it. Yes?
Yes.
Right. Now, which member state would you say is doing least well in explaining to British citizens what the system is going to be, ease of application? Because since you said, Ms Golding at the beginning, quite correctly, it's going to be different in different places. We are interested in the detail, and your document does cover that. Who really needs to pull their socks up in terms of the other 27 member states?
Well, I mean, again, it depends.
Well, this is your chance.
Yeah. I mean, again, it depends on that. You have to look at the detail. There are, I mean, what we've explained in the paper is that there are some countries that to date haven't adopted any legislation, other than perhaps emergency legislation. And those countries are Germany, Cyprus and Romania. They will adopt legislation on Brexit date, on the withdrawal date, if it happens. Then there are other countries that have adopted legislation, but they state in the EC table that we also link to in our paper that there could be some movement on what has been proposed, depending on how the negotiations develop, depending on whether there might be some form of EU-UK coordinated solution. Then there are other countries that have perhaps adopted quite detailed legislation, for example, Spain and France, but which make very clear that what has been adopted, the framework that's been adopted, is subject to reciprocity. and in particular reciprocity as regards the citizens of that particular country here in the UK. But in the example of Spain, for example, it's reciprocity across the board. John Richards can give further detail on that.
Just, well, on those two countries, since you mentioned France and Spain, looking at what is happening in the UK at the moment and the evidence we've just heard, would those governments say, yeah, it looks like there's reciprocity in the UK for the purposes of the laws which we have passed, or not?
Can I speak a little bit for France?
Yes, please.
The feeling we're getting, talking to French officials and French politicians, is that they are not yet happy to say, yes, there is definitely reciprocity. They don't trust the UK. They feel that the UK has a policy of withholding rights rather than granting rights. They would really like to see EU citizens' rights enshrined in primary legislation. So there's a very big concern about reciprocity in France because, as Jane has just said, it's reciprocity with EU citizens here in the UK, but it's also reciprocity amongst goods and provision of goods and services. So if, for example, the UK doesn't reciprocate in the provisions that France has put into place via legislation on provision of goods and services, transport of people, transport of goods, then British citizens living in France could see their rights in a no-deal Brexit suspended.
Transport of goods?
Transport of goods.
Could you clarify, just explain what you mean by that?
Under the French no-deal legislation, there are three aspects. There's an act, which sits at the top, then there's an ordinance, or several ordinances, and then there are decrees which explain the functioning of each ordinance. So under the Act, there are ordinances covering citizens' rights, transport of people, transport of goods, and a number of other things. The Act makes reciprocity contingent on citizens' rights, different aspects of citizens' rights, and transport of goods and people. So, and each of those has an ordinance which has a very clear statement of reciprocity in it. So, for example, under transport of goods and people, if the UK doesn't reciprocate on citizens' rights for French citizens, those aspects of transport and goods and people would also be suspended in the UK, in France. So there is it's an extremely worrying thing obviously for British people living in France, because our rights in a no-deal Brexit are contingent on the UK playing ball on transport issues.
But isn't that a bit unreasonable to say that the rights of British citizens in France might be held hostage to a failure to agree something on the transport of goods when we're talking about the rights of citizens? I struggle to see the connection. I can see why a member state might say, we'll look at how you treat our citizens and we'll treat your citizens the same, and that would be fair and reasonable. But to bring in, that's why my brow furrowed at that point, the question of the transport of goods. Is that to do with tariffs or lorries or what? I don't see the connection.
It's to do with the actual ordinance covering transport. It's to do with three things. It's to do with the right of British operators to operate on French soil, the right of British operators to transit France carrying goods or passengers, and the right of British operators to transport between the UK and France. It's those three very specific things that are subject to reciprocity.
Right. Okay. Now, Mr. Richards, Spain.
So far as Spain is concerned, on the 1st of March they adopted a decree which is designed to avoid there being a legal vacuum for a number of areas. Those include citizens' rights, but also other areas, police and judicial cooperation, financial services in part, and also, as Calber has mentioned, there are transport aspects. Spain is obviously concerned about reciprocity because the decree has basically a number of levels of reciprocity. There's an across-the-board provision in the opening part of the decree, which says that within a 2-month period, if an assessment is that there isn't reciprocity across the board on all the areas, so a rather similar approach to the one my colleague mentioned, there is the possibility of revoking the decree. But I think perhaps more relevantly for these sort of discussions, when you enter into the specific parts of the decree dealing with things like social security, rights for employment, pensions, those normally all have a specific last paragraph which says and what is being done is done contingent on the UK also providing similar treatment for Spanish nationals resident in the UK. And there's a final sort of reciprocity aspect in that there's a 21-month grace period to apply within the decree. And during that period, there are a number of rights relating to pensions, social security and health in particular, which are maintained, but they're also contingent on there being some form of bilateral arrangement agreed during that time to be of a more permanent nature, whether it's bilateral or whether it's a multilateral framework agreement. But that means at the end of the 21-month grace period, a number of areas which are certain during that period in terms of your rights to healthcare, social security and pensions, they have to be dealt with. So that's not quite reciprocity, but it's another aspect of uncertainty, if you like, being entered into the system. The decree is adopted to cater for a no-deal situation, and I'm not sure that I can't speak personally, but I'm not sure the Spanish authorities have embarked on an at this point measuring of reciprocity. I think their ideas of reciprocity will be if there is no deal and if their decree then comes into force, that they will take it on the basis of what is written in their legislation.
But so it is possible that in the event of no deal and after 21 months, that the right of British citizens living in Spain to, for example, healthcare would end? Would the Spanish government actually do that, do you think?
I think it's a question of Spanish legislation, as I understand it, has a relatively generous provision for healthcare of people who are in the country, but it's more a question of who pays, and it's more a question of whether the existing arrangements will continue or will not. And the decree provides that the current system will be regarded on the Spanish side as being one which is to continue, but within the 21-month period there needs to be something which I think deals with things on a more permanent basis. That's my understanding of the situation.
Are any of the rest of you aware of anything similar in relation to rights to healthcare that might be at risk in other EU member states in the event of no deal?
Yes. You go ahead.
Well, in the Italian legislation, which is, unlike the Spanish, the Italian legislation on Brexit rights for citizens is probably 2 sides of A4. It's very, very brief indeed and contains very little detail, but it does deal with the continuation of the S1 scheme, which is the reciprocal healthcare scheme in the EU for the country which pays a pensioner's pension to also be responsible for the cost of healthcare administered in the country where they're living. And the Italians have a provision in their law which extends that until the end of 2020, subject to reciprocity.
It's also potentially an issue in Luxembourg for people insured under the S1 scheme as well.
And it's potentially an issue in Germany. I mean, the situation at the moment is there is an emergency legislation was passed which did cover some issues post withdrawal date, and one of those is healthcare. I think what the German authorities are hoping for is ultimately that there will be some form of reciprocal arrangement at EU-UK level or bilateral arrangement. However, obviously the S1 scheme at the current state of affairs would fall away, and the only option that would then be open to S1 holders is to switch to a German health insurance company, but that would be at a cost, and they would have a 3-month window during a grace period following withdrawal date in order to make that decision.
Now, listen to what you've said. What would you, as an organisation, say to those in the UK who are advocating that, to borrow a phrase, come hell or high water, we should leave either with a deal, but if not, with no deal on the 31st of October, come what may? Where would that, leaving on the 31st of October without a deal, leave the people that you are representing here today?
I would say that the overriding issue, it would leave us in a significantly worse position than a deal, significantly worse, and the overriding issue would be the uncertainty of our situation. Grace periods might come into place in all of the EU 27 at that point. However, we, in many countries, have no idea or have little clarity about what the final permanent status would be. So,
I don't know whether you've taken the view, but would a no-deal Brexit be something that you would recommend on behalf of the people you are representing here today? Well, just for the record, your facial expressions, but if you could, would you recommend a no-deal Brexit?
No. We would absolutely not recommend.
Any of you? No. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 witnesses saying you would not recommend a no-deal Brexit. Do you think that point is being heard by those who are making this argument?
It's very hard for us to say. It really is. It's not featuring high in the list of topics of discussion, if I can put it that way.
Right. Okay. Now, that is extremely helpful. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for coming in to give evidence today. There's two different views that you can take on the responsibility of your host countries to protect your rights. One is that the government of France, Spain, Italy, Germany has got a responsibility to you, regardless of what happens anywhere else. Another is that they didn't cause the problem, and that it's reasonable for them to wait and see what approaches the UK government makes to their citizens on the basis that it's not realistic to expect Germany to treat British immigrants in Germany significantly differently from Britain treats German immigrants lying here. What's your take on that? Obviously from your individual interests you would like your host countries to give you an absolute guarantee of everything, but as an organisation, where would you put yourselves on that spectrum from, on the one hand, saying it's entirely up to the British government to fix it and other governments will follow suit, or the argument we get from some people in the UK, which is, regardless of what Britain does to immigrants living in Britain, the British immigrants living overseas should have the rights protected unconditionally by the host countries?
I think primary responsibility lies with the British government, our own government. We are British citizens, and so far we have been very badly let down, I think it's honest to say, by the British government's response. We are losing a whole set of rights because of red lines laid down by the British government, and there is a lot more that they could be doing to protect our rights. I think it varies from country to country, but on the whole, our host countries have shown a degree of flexibility and understanding for our position, but they are increasingly hardline, given what is happening, or rather not happening, here in London, and given the lack of political decisions that are not being taken that we need to be taken. So ultimately our host states are saying we will do what we can, but they are not going to go out on a limb, especially when they are still concerned about the fate of their own citizens. And just to go back to the reciprocity point, even though legislation in other countries doesn't overtly mention it, when you sit in meetings with these governments, they are very, very clear that they will also act on reciprocity. So we are living in limbo 3 years on, and we're really looking to our own government to provide some answers and support, because that has been sadly lacking.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add to that? I saw quite a lot of nodding from the rest of the panel. Does anyone want to? Would anyone sort of disagree with anything that Jonas said?
I don't think, in a sense, we're so concerned about who's morally responsible for the state we're in. We are really concerned about the effect of the debate upon citizens' rights, and I think it's got to the stage where our initial call, and that of the 3 million, was that we should not be treated as bargaining chips, and increasingly as this game plays out, we are more and more becoming bargaining chips, and that's a real concern, for which I wouldn't want to say it's the British fault or the EU's fault. It's a process which is going on, and frankly it should not be going on, because citizens' rights are above that, and both sides promised from the beginning that they would be above that, but it's not happening.
Thank you. We heard evidence previously from the 3 million that regardless of what the UK government was saying, that migrants here were always made welcome with their rights protected, that there had been a very worrying increase in incidents of xenophobia and racism directed not only against EU migrants living here, but against migrants from other countries, and frankly against anyone who looked as if they might have been a migrant. Have you experienced anything similar directed against UK nationals living in other EU countries since the referendum, or as a result of what's happened since then?
I think it's fair to say no, we haven't. We haven't experienced anything at all along the lines that EU citizens here report on a pretty much daily basis. I think most of us feel our countries as a whole still welcome us as people on a personal level, even if there are political issues about how to protect our rights. On a day-to-day basis, we have asked all our member groups whether they've got evidence of discrimination, and very, very little has come up apart from some discrimination possibly in the field of employment rights in Belgium that we mention in our evidence.
Pardon, I don't mean to interrupt. The acoustics are very poor in here. If you could maybe speak a little louder and a bit closer to the microphone, that would be really helpful.
Yeah,
thank you.
Okay. But yes, on a level of day-to-day living, then no, we are not experiencing discrimination.
The example of employment rights that Carver just mentioned is quite interesting, because it's very practical. It's people saying to British employees, well, your future may be in doubt because we don't know what's going to happen down the line. People are applying for jobs and not getting them because they're British, and there may be a problem. So it's that sort of rather practical thing. It's not a, if you call it racist, whatever, it's not because we're British that they don't like us that things are happening. It's because there are practical concerns about the future, which mean that it might make more sense for a particular company to employ someone different.
And employers are, in fact, we have heard instances of employers contacting their employees to say, when the UK withdraws from the EU, you will have to present us with a residence permit, and already warning them of this issue.
Okay. Would it be fair to say, in fact, that the kind of approach that you've described that some employers are taking towards hiring employees who are British citizens, is it similar to what some businesses are doing in their setting of trade contracts? They don't have an issue with taking on a contract with a British supplier just now, but they're a bit concerned as to whether the contract will be deliverable in the future. Is that what you're saying? It's more a kind of a practical issue that they might give a job to a UK national who becomes an illegal resident in a year's time, and that the employer then has to sort it out. It's certainly an interesting comment, and I think you've mentioned that in the evidence document you submitted to the committee a few days ago, so that will be recorded as part of today's evidence. One sort of final question, and the Chair kind of touched on it earlier on. At the moment, you're all living with full citizens' rights in a collection of countries across Europe, simply because you got citizenship of one of 28 countries. As well as those who are suggesting that we leave at the end of October, regardless of what the consequences are, there are some who've been saying pretty much since the day after the referendum we could just hand in a notice immediately, walk out, and it wouldn't make any difference. If the UK was to leave without a deal next week or next month or at the end of October, leaving aside for a moment what we would all hope the reaction would be from your host countries, what rights do you have as a UK citizen living in an EU country on Saturday if the UK walks out without a deal on the Friday? As a matter of actual law, what legal and enforceable rights do you have the day after we leave without a deal?
No. Well, the first things, I mean, the really major things that we have at the moment are free movement, the right of free movement, obviously. So that gives us the right to work across the whole EU27. It gives us the right to have our professional qualifications recognised across the EU27. It means we can work cross-border. It means we can provide cross-border services. So in terms of employment, that would be huge rights that would fall away, and that would only be, I mean, certainly free movement would not even be covered by the withdrawal agreement, and some of these issues are not fully covered by the withdrawal agreement.
Okay.
And if it was no deal, we'd have the additional problem that, as we've said, we face uncertainty. I think a lot of countries are doing a wait and see. Let's see what happens by September, October, and perhaps fill in the gaps. At the moment, those gaps would be not filled in, and they would have to start thinking very hard and very quickly about rights. And I would imagine the consequence would be that for issues of healthcare, issues of social security, all sorts of issues of getting into the country, all sorts of practical problems, you would have a very mixed bag, because there would not be enough central direction in the countries to lay down what should be happening.
Okay. But you would no longer have the guaranteed rights under the EU treaties?
No.
No.
Okay, so you would depend on the sensibleness or reasonableness of your
Well, it depends also on the laws, which, insofar as they had been legislation in the various countries, they would generally kick in automatically. But our point there is that, for the most part, there remains a great deal of uncertainty even with those laws.
Okay.
Without any contingency legislation, we would become illegal.
Right, so does that apply to all 27 states, or are there some EU member states where British nationals face the prospect of no longer having a right to live there the day after?
If a country has no legislation in place, no grace period, then at the moment the UK leaves without a deal, the UK citizen has no rights because they haven't entered that country as a third country national, and they haven't gone through the process of obtaining a visa, obtaining a residence card as a third country national. Hence the importance of the contingency legislation, which actually stops there being a cliff edge between being legal and illegal.
We've got other colleagues who've got other parliamentary business who do want to come in. Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you. Just very briefly, thank you very much indeed for the extremely helpful document that you produced. I notice, this would have probably been obvious to those people who live across the EU, but not for many others, that the rights for holding dual nationality clearly are very different from one country to another. And I notice, particularly in the case of Spain, that after leaving the EU, in fact, Spanish citizens living in the UK will have rights after permanent residence in the UK for 5 years to apply for UK citizenship, but the converse would not apply for British citizens living in Spain because of their rules over dual nationality, and the same seems to be true in other countries as well. Is this something which is commonly appreciated by British citizens living across the EU, that there are these big differences in application for citizenship and holding of dual citizenship? And is it your appreciation that this is known to British citizens more generally who might be thinking of going to work in other EU states? Perhaps Mr. Richards, because...
Well, just to start, because others will have also comments, Spanish nationality is something which is a long period of residence. It's 10 years, shorter if you're married, obviously, to a Spanish person. Then there are cultural and linguistic tests, but that's common to most nationality systems. But you have to give up, if you're British, you have to give up your passport. Certain nationalities can retain their passports, but those are more those with South American, shall we say, connection. They are traditional countries with which Spain has other links. So you'd have to renounce your British nationality to get a Spanish passport.
But it wouldn't be the case the other way round.
But the other way round is that you do not have to renounce your Spanish nationality if you, as a Spanish person, take nationality in the UK. So Spanish citizens living in the UK have a shorter residence period. They have a relatively hefty fee, but they can obtain UK nationality in circumstances where a UK resident in Spain has a rather different, more cumbersome, much longer procedure where dual nationality is not a possibility. So you ask the question whether people appreciate this, and I think certainly in the UK there tends to be a bit of an off-the-cuff reaction of, oh, why don't you just apply for nationality? Surely they'll give you nationality. That's obviously, from what I've described, not an appropriate response.
Right, so just to make perhaps a point about reciprocity, actually, in many cases it's not going to exist because UK citizens will have worse rights reciprocally than Spanish citizens because a UK citizen going to Spain wishing to take up Spanish citizenship would have to renounce UK citizenship, whereas the reverse is not the case. So I'm wondering quite how this reciprocity actually applies, or whether it's only applicable in certain areas and not where it favours the EU 27.
I don't think it's not designed like that. I think the idea is that reciprocity is not really a matter for the Brexit debate. Reciprocity on citizenship is not a matter for the Brexit debate. Citizenship is, par excellence, a national issue which each country decides, and the EU.
I just wanted to make that clear because it's
role in.
It's quite clear from your paper that there isn't that in terms of citizenship. All we're talking about is EU citizens' rights, but actually, the taking of citizenship is something that clearly your members are having to consider and have considered in many cases, and it's very different from one country to another.
Yes.
Yes, that's absolutely right.
You could make a parallel with voting rights, and we know that there have been, 3 agreements, I think, made recently, bilateral with Britain and certain EU countries to enable voting rights in local elections to continue. That's because it's not an EU responsibility, and therefore it's a matter for each country to decide. Citizenship is very much in the same camp. It's a national issue which the EU does not interfere with.
So do you think that this difference between things that are national issues and those which have come out of our membership of the EU, that is understood sufficiently and made clear both by our government when interacting with EU citizens in the 27 and vice versa, or are the two sometimes mixed up?
It's very hard to say. I think sometimes it is mixed up, and I think a lot of UK citizens who don't actually understand what's going on at UK-EU level in terms of the negotiations or contingency plans, for them they see citizenship as their insurance policy. And they don't completely understand how that relates to everything else that is going on. That is true to say.
And they don't necessarily appreciate also, as we point out in the paper, that even if you are fortunate enough to be able to become a dual national, that's not a panacea for everything. There will still be rights that we will lose even as dual citizens, such as surrendersing rights, for example, spousal reunification.
Or professional qualification. Because you can change your citizenship, that doesn't change the origin of your qualification.
And just finally, it also seems that in some countries, such as Belgium, different local authorities might take a different approach to applications for citizenship. Is that the case? That seemed to come out of the paper.
That's mainly related to British citizens who have been EU officials because they hold a different type of residence card. So there we can see a clear difference between the approach of the Belgian government and the Luxembourgish government. In Luxembourg, that special ID card for EU officials, British EU officials, is enough to recognise the 5 years of residence needed to acquire or apply for citizenship. The Belgian government, up until recently, has not been recognising even 30 years residence under that particular card as residence sufficient to acquire citizenship, but there have been court cases now. So it is being worked out, but in some communes and some areas you still have to kind of threaten to go to court before you are granted citizenship.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Seema Malhotra.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just have a very brief question for you, and thank you for coming to give evidence to us today. The Chair wrote to the Foreign Secretary in May and asked for an update on the progress with plans in each member state, and the Foreign Office had overseen a series of almost 500 outreach events for UK nationals over the last sort of 18 months. I was just interested to know whether you had attended any of those events, whether you felt that they picked up all the issues, and certainly we've been through the key issues, which do vary slightly by country, but are still sort of broadly similar around residency, pensions. Perhaps we haven't talked so much about that, healthcare, travel, and free movement. Was that an effective process? Does it need to continue? And what would your feedback be, perhaps, if there was anything that you felt hadn't been brought out as much in terms of what's of most cause for concern for citizens, UK citizens?
Well, perhaps I can start with Germany, because I'm also, as well as being co-chair of British in Europe, I'm also chair of British in Germany. And British in Germany, with the embassy in Germany, we've cooperated on a large number of events across Germany. Of course, Germany is a federal state, so there will be differences in the approach from land to land, and so we've been trying to cover as many areas as possible. I would say that there have been a lot of events, which is good, and I would say that some of them, until recently, focused too much on the withdrawal agreement and not enough on no-deal contingency. I think now there's been more focus from the embassy side on no-deal contingency, and what they have done with us and with German authorities, for example, in Berlin in the last few months, is actually organise info fairs, so that people can come along. There's a very short presentation at the beginning, rather than a long speech about what the current government position is. There's people can go to stands where they can actually talk to German officials about issues like residency, insurance, health insurance, employment, professional qualifications, all of those different areas. And I must say, I think that that is something that people in Germany, our members, have appreciated that approach, and it would be good to be going. Those sort of events are needed more and more cooperation with the authorities in country, and more focus on being able to answer people's individual questions when they come along to an event.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the situation in France, which is not quite so developed as the situation in Germany. We have a very different population. We're a rural population. So British citizens in France are spread over a really, really wide area, with some living an hour, 2 hours from a big centre of population, which means that events that have been arranged don't necessarily have a very large catchment area for people. One of the big problems has been they've often been arranged at very short notice, sometimes a week, 10 days. They've often been arranged during working hours. So we've noticed that the numbers of people attending have been decreasing, whereas when they began, we were perhaps seeing 100, 200, 300 people. They were selling out. Now it can sometimes be 20, 30. So there's a kind of a vicious circle where fewer people are attending, so fewer events are organised. They don't have a terribly good feedback because they don't. People say to us that they're not really addressing the issues. So therefore people don't go. Another problem is that they are only advertised via social media, Facebook particularly, and you're simply not going to reach all British people living in France via social media. And of course that leads on to a whole big question about communication and outreach, which if we've got time it would be good if we could come back to. So yeah, we don't have the same very positive reports that Germany has. It could do better.
I think, speaking for Italy, we have had a lot of outreach meetings. Again, it's a population which is difficult to reach. It's partly rural, partly urban, but spread all over a very long country. And so the meetings tend to be, if you get 30, 40 people, you've really done quite well. And we've had the same experience from British in Italy organising our own things. I think one of the problems was that certainly in the early days there was a great tendency to sell the party line. So, for example, I remember the ambassador giving a talk about a week before the second of the votes in the House of Commons on the withdrawal agreement, where it was fairly clear from the press that it was highly unlikely to be passed, being confident that it was all going to go through. That kind of thing's not helpful because people are realistic. There's been a great improvement, I would say, over the last year, with much more focused attention on rights. There's always the problem that government spokesmen have, not perhaps going too far. By and large, if you wanted to find out what your rights are in Italy, you're better off looking at a British in Italy website, because we can be franker and clearer, or we can express doubts, whereas because of the desire for the government to maintain the relationship with the Italian government, they'll perhaps be rather more cautious in their wording. As I understand it, there's, for example, there's a living-in guide in relation to each country in the EU27, which is it's organised by the FCO, but you get it through your local embassy website. That is all vetted by London, and so it tends to be a bit bland at times and not helpful.
So far as Spain is concerned, I think the British Embassy has made a lot of effort in respect of outreach, because there's quite a large population. But I think their main thrust has been to try and ensure that those who are resident but who haven't been through the Spanish formal residence procedures but are really living in Spain do get formally registered, so that they don't fall into a position so basically that they can take the benefit of either, the assumption was originally the withdrawal agreement, but now also it would be this decree, because they will already be within the system and so continue. So a lot of effort was put into that, but a lot of information has been given. I would agree that as representatives of the British government, you're obliged to have a sort of party line approach, which I think is difficult to avoid. And there, I think residents also use the filter of our associations. There are associations on the coast. Mine Euro Citizens is basically concentrated on Madrid, and we've all had a lot of interaction, both with the British authorities in the form of the embassy and the Spanish authorities. So there is a way that people can get information. We all have meetings of our respective organisations, and well attended from time to time, less so on other occasions. But I think that combined with the fact that the Spanish government has a really rather comprehensive website, and echoing back to a linguistic comment made in the earlier panel, it's also fully in English, so that if you are an English speaker, you can look and you can see the basic components of this decree laid out. So it's not that people are living completely in the dark, but of course things can always be better, and people are always concerned about their situation, and there is an element of uncertainty that just can't be explained however much outreach you have.
Everything that's been said previously is true for Benelux as well.
Can I ask you about the declaratory system that some member states are using? How does that work? And where does that then leave those who have declared when it comes to paperwork to show that they do in fact have the right to be in the country they've been living in for quite some time?
I think the answer is don't know, because it hasn't started yet.
So nowhere has it started yet?
I don't think it has. I mean, people in Holland have received letters.
Yeah, in Luxembourg as well. In Luxembourg and the Netherlands, letters were sent out to every British citizen by the government. But, I mean, we have a system of registration in most of our countries, so most of us are already registered anyway. But the withdrawal agreement declaratory system has not started yet. Or constitutive, yeah, go on.
Can I just add something to that? Well, the declaratory system is a system that we have across the EU 27 now under EU law. I mean, declaratory of our rights as EU citizens. And, I mean, it's been working for a very long time. It doesn't seem to cause any problems. And part of the reason for that is because there's a misunderstanding that a declaratory system doesn't mean to say that you can't, that the country and your host country can't insist that you're registered. And in most countries, there may be a declaratory system under EU law for EU citizens currently, but there is also a mandatory registration system, which is exactly the system that could be implemented under the withdrawal agreement if the choice was to go down the route of the declaratory system.
Right. But if someone said, show us that you have the right to reside, to work in one of the 27 member states, what would British citizens be expected to produce? Bearing in mind you've just said we don't know, but presumably there'd have to be some documentation.
Well, the documentation that I have to provide in Germany now, that I am registered under the mandatory registration system, is a simple document that shows I am registered. In other countries, there are actually forms of cards, of registration cards, and perhaps
So it wouldn't be.
you can explain, Jeremy, the system in Italy.
Well, now suddenly they're all coming out.
Yes.
Put your cards. Indeed, indeed. So it's declaratory, but with a document.
Yes.
So
Yes.
even for those who are declaring,
Yes.
who are arguing that there should be a declaratory system here in the UK, for the other countries where there may well end up being one, it will still involve a document.
It will involve a document. It just won't involve an application that could be rejected.
So you what?
So
you
it's
get
a
the
simple
document
registration.
automatically?
It's a simple registration system. If you're fulfilling the conditions under EU law, then you will get your document. But you don't have to apply for the status.
You said fulfilling the conditions under EU law. If you don't fulfil the conditions, you might be rejected for the document. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes. So, right, okay. It's a bit like if you're applying for settled status under the current scheme here in the UK, if you fulfil the conditions, you get it, and if you don't fulfil the conditions, you might not. Well, so it's not in that. I'm just trying to see what the difference is.
I think the difference is that settled status is a different status from what you have under your EU rights, and so you're applying for something different. If you look at the Spanish system in the decree, it's declaratory in the sense that there's a distinction between those who've been more than 5 years and so have a right to permanent residency and those less than 5 years. Life is more complicated for those who've been there for less than 5 years, but the basic reading the decree, the impression that I have is that if you produce your piece of paper that shows that you were registered at a particular point in time, that will allow you to receive what is called the TIE, Tarjeta de Identificación de Extranjero, and that you will get simply on production of the document. So to that extent, it's declaratory, but you will have gone through the procedure that Spain has under EU law to have the document. If you've been less than 5 years, you will also have to produce what is the current position under EU law, which is proof of health insurance and a minimum income level or employment or whatever. So it's basically referring back to a level which is the previous existing EU level. The income requirement, for example, has been taken as what is in EU law rather than what the Spanish have for third country nationals arriving afresh in the country, for example.
Okay.
I mean, there's an element of angels dancing on the head of a pin in the discussion between declaratory and constitutive. But just to make this point, your rights under a declaratory system derive from the law rather than from the possession of a piece of paper. And the effect of that is that if you are one of the many hard-to-reach people, and I think Kuba, who gave evidence in the earlier group, made the point very well, there are people who will never be reached through any amount of outreach, which is just obvious. But if in 5 years' time they need something and they need to produce evidence of their status, they won't be told, you haven't got the piece of paper, you didn't get it in time, you're out, you're not having what you want, and you might have to leave the country. They'll be able to get it if they can demonstrate that at the appropriate time they met the requirements. So the piece of paper is less important. It's not all important as it is under a constitutive scheme. You have to have evidence of your status, and those who haven't got it in time will not have the status. That's the difference.
Can I just pursue the point about the Costa Amendment? And what do you think of the EU's response that says, well, it's all very difficult, it'll have to be member state by member state, because even outside a withdrawal agreement, even in the event of a no-deal Brexit, we can't really conclude a deal that binds all of us. What do you think of their response?
We're very disappointed, quite frankly.
Yep.
I mean, we mentioned in our paper the process which UK went through after the Costa Amendment. We thought the initial approach to the EU was pretty lukewarm, but we were very much heartened by the letter which Stephen Barclay wrote after our recent meeting with the 3 million and with Mr. Costa, and it was a strong letter which set out the position very clearly. What has to be appreciated, and I think this is a response to Ms. Malhotra's question of the 3 million, is that the reason why a ring-fencing agreement has to be made before Britain leaves the EU is not simply that we need the certainty of knowing what our rights are going to be. That, of course, is an important reason. But there's a legal reason, which is that if the agreement is made under Article 50, while Britain is still a member of the EU, the process is very much more simple. It doesn't require unanimous agreement across all the parliaments, including regional parliaments. And so it's absolutely critical that any default agreement, if I can call it that, on citizens' rights takes place before Britain's exit. And we would strongly encourage the British government to keep up the pressure. We are doing so for our part among the nation states in the EU and with centrally in our lobbying there.
Do you think the EU is being unreasonable in saying, no, we're not going to separate it out in the event of a no-deal Brexit? The question of citizens' rights. Because they could do it if they wanted to, couldn't they?
Frankly, I do.
If the political will was there.
It's about political will.
If the political will was there, and also I wanted to add something to what Jeremy said from the political perspective, and Michel Barnier's letter. Nothing will move on this via the Commission. This will only move if the Council, the EU Council, makes a decision. So the decision on this lies in the EU 27, in each of the EU 27.
But isn't it a bit odd that we've spent quite a bit of this evidence session discussing the 27 member states' insistence on reciprocity, and yet the means of ensuring reciprocity all ways round would be to ring-fence an agreement on citizens' rights, but it's the EU member states who don't appear very keen on it? Or is it they haven't noticed that the Commission has said, we can't really do that under Article 50 and it'll have to be down to each member state individually? Why do you think that is?
I think there's a strategic line which has been taken, which is it's withdrawal agreement or nothing, and that includes even citizens' rights. No mini deals was the original catchphrase, I suppose. What was important, the point that the 3 million made, was that in Barnier's letter, in reply to Stephen Barclay's recent letter, we didn't get anything about nothing is agreed till everything is agreed, no mini deals. We would hope that there is still room for that discussion to take place. But as Jane says, it does require pressure from the member states to change their minds. But as you probably know, the Dutch Parliament passed a resolution supporting ring fencing.
Can I just ask you about voting rights? What's the position regarding offers of voting rights to UK citizens remaining in EU member states in the event of no deal?
It varies by country to country.
It varies, yeah.
I mean, some countries allow everybody after a certain period of residence, usually 5 years, EU or non-EU, to vote in local elections. There are treaties which are being signed, or agreements which are being signed at the moment between the UK and certain countries. I think Spain's just got one, Luxembourg got one a couple of weeks ago, and Portugal as well. So we will have local voting rights. Obviously we'll lose EP, and we won't have national. But obviously 60% of us don't have general election voting rights here in the UK either.
The Spanish agreement with the UK goes a good deal further than most Spanish agreements from a Spanish perspective, because it allows you not just to vote but also to stand for election in local elections. So you can sit on a council, you can be a mayor of a council, as well as just voting. So, and that is something which they have negotiated with the UK, which goes, on my understanding, goes a bit beyond. They have other agreements which do that as well, but not many.
I'd also say it's quite logical, because it'd be a bit odd to give someone the right to vote in an election, but not the right to stand for office.
There is another outlier, of course, which is the Republic of Ireland. The Memorandum of Understanding obviously continues. There is another outlier, obviously, the Memorandum of Understanding between the UK and the Republic of Ireland, which was signed, I think, the 8th of May, does continue the right for UK nationals in Ireland and Irish nationals here to continue to stand and vote in even general elections as well.
Sure. And that stems from the common travel area and agreements that predate our membership of the common market as it then was originally. So that is quite a specific case. Finally, are there, going back to this point, because it's what's come across very clearly from the evidence today is what you may and your members may end up getting depends on the perception of the state in which you're living's view of what the British government is offering to their citizens living here. Are there things that are missing from the British unilateral offer to EU citizens here in the UK in the event of no deal that you would like to see the UK government offering in order to maximise the chance that the member state in which you're living will offer them to you and your fellow British citizens?
Shall I? I'll begin. I mean, I think the biggest point that is often mentioned in our discussions is primary legislation. That would be very helpful, setting out the rights. A second point that would help us is if the UK changed its mind on the system and moved to a declaratory rather than a constitutive system. That would help us. Jeremy, is there anything you want to add?
I think it's quite hard for us to say that these are particular points that have been picked up by member states with us. But I certainly feel that the removal of appeal rights, when the UK was saying this is our no-deal package compared with the deal package, to remove appeal rights was something which sent a very bad signal about the future prospects of EU citizens here.
Okay. Now, just in conclusion, was there anything you had wanted to say that the questions you've had from us haven't given you the chance to express? And once again, thank you very much for the terrific document that you submitted to us. But was there any other points you wanted to add before we bring the session to a close?
I just wanted to add one the point on the voting rights, just to make that point very clearly, that those of us who have been living in a host country for more than 15 years, and if in that host country there are not voting rights for third country nationals or for British citizens post-Brexit, those people will have no voting rights in anywhere until they can obtain citizenship. And we've already had a discussion about the difficulties of obtaining citizenship, and that the conditions differ across the EU 27.
And there were problems, were there not, in those who are able to vote in the UK getting their ballot papers in time? I know from one constituency case that I dealt with in the recent elections. Is that correct?
Yes, and that is a perennial problem
Right.
in every, I mean, not just in the European elections, but in every national vote. It's a problem that came up in 2015, 16 and 17, and bear in mind only less than 40% of UK citizens abroad could vote in those votes.
Okay. There is also a problem which I think is linked to loss of the right to vote, which is basically that you end up in a situation where you have no elected representatives to which you can address yourself, because even if you write to the person who is the MP for your last known constituency, in other words, where you would be put if the right to vote for life legislation were to be carried forward, basically MPs, if you do not have an address in their constituency or a relative who can provide an address, basically tend to ignore any correspondence. So I have written to the person who would be the person would be my point if things were to progress in that direction, but I've had no reply. And this is very common it's something which our membership stress over and over again, that it's impossible to engage with an elected House of Commons representative, or very, very difficult. And the UK obviously doesn't have a system of a representative for an external constituency or some of the solutions that are provided in other jurisdictions. And I was asked specifically to bring this point up with the committee, that there is a feeling of basically being in a void and not being able to have any response from a democratically elected person anywhere, because you've ended up in that situation. So that's maybe something that members would like to bear as a way to carry things forward in terms of their interaction with the 1.2, 1.5 million UK citizens who are living in Europe.
Well, I hope, concluding on that point, I hope today has helped to fill any void there may be, because you've had the opportunity.
Much.
No, well,
I wasn't
fishing for thanks, but I was just pointing out you're here precisely because this group of members, as the exiting the EU Select Committee, are very keen once again to hear from you about the experience and the worries and concerns of your members and our fellow citizens. That's who we're talking about in the other member states. And I'm confident you will continue to see the concerns you've raised with us reflected in the reports that we produce in an effort to influence those who are making decisions. In this particular case, it's the other 27 member states we're trying to talk to through a megaphone, as well as the government of this country. On behalf of all of the members, can I thank you very much for coming. It's been a really useful and informative session. Order, order.
Ended. The proceeding has 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 ended.